November rain came slanting across the wharf-lined docks, and the woman sitting on the sidewalk outside Hollis Marsh's store was soaked past the point where more rain could make any difference. $3.40 lay scattered in the puddle beside her, where the handful of coins had slipped from her fingers when her left knee gave out on the third step. Behind the glass, 7 people stood exactly where they had been standing, and every one of them found something remarkably interesting on the shelves at the very same moment. Maren Aldridge brought one hand up to cover the 5 months she was carrying beneath that oversized coat, and for the first time in 3 days, she didn't have anything left in her to keep her chin up. What made her look up was the shadow. A man had come to stand between her and the rain-tall, black wool coat, no umbrella. Water ran off his shoulders and onto the pavement, and he simply stood there, letting himself get soaked so that she wouldn't. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't ask if she was all right. He looked at the puddle, at the coins, then straight into her eyes. "Don't cry," he said, and his voice was so quiet that the rain should have swallowed it. But it didn't. "You made it 3 steps before you went down. Those 3 steps belong to you. Nobody can take them." She opened her mouth to say she wasn't crying, that it was only rainwater, that she didn't need anybody's pity, but he had already crouched down, bringing himself level with her eyes instead of looking down at her. And he finished in that same quiet voice, "Now get up, and come with me." What Maren Aldridge could not have known in that moment was that this man had spent 15 years searching not for her, but for someone already dead. And the rain that day was no accident. If this story reaches your heart, please leave a like, drop a comment, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel to walk with Maren all the way to the final word. The car was absurdly warm. That was the first thing Maren noticed when the door closed, and the sound of the rain suddenly receded, becoming something harmless, tapping against the metal roof. The man turned the heater all the way up without asking her a single question, and in less than a minute, steam had risen across the windows, covering the glass, and turning the entire harbor outside into a shapeless blur of gray. He reached toward the back seat, took out a wool blanket folded into a neat square, and placed it on her lap. She pushed it back toward him. "I don't need it." He didn't argue. He simply left the blanket between them, on the empty space separating the 2 seats, and said in the same quiet voice she'd heard outside, "Then just leave it there." The car began to move. She sat still for about 2 blocks, then felt the cold beginning to seep outward from inside her bones, rather than from her wet clothes. And she thought of the thing growing inside her, the thing that knew nothing about $3.40, or about the 7 people behind the glass. She pulled the blanket over herself. Not for her. She wanted to say that aloud, wanted to make it clear that she was accepting it for the baby, and not because she was weak. But the man kept his eyes straight ahead on the road, and never once turned to see whether she'd taken it, as though the matter had never been a negotiation in the first place. Her left knee was still bleeding through the fabric. She searched inside her coat pocket and found the old handkerchief she always carried, a piece of cotton gone soft from being washed too many times, and she folded it into quarters before pressing it against the tier. It was such a familiar motion that she did it without looking. But beside her, the car drifted partway out of its lane, not by much, just the smallest turn of the wheel, hardly enough to notice, and then he corrected it immediately. But Maren had lived long enough in rooms with people who lied to know that the human body always betrayed the truth before the mouth did. She looked up. He was staring down at her hand, or more precisely at the corner of the handkerchief where several faded embroidered stitches remained, and not a single feature of his face changed, but the knuckles gripping the steering wheel had gone white. "What just happened to you?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "The road's slick." Then, after a silence longer than necessary, he asked, "What's your name?" "Aldridge," she said. "Maren Aldridge." 4 blocks passed. 4 blocks, and he didn't say another word. Streetlights smeared across the fogged glass in long bands of yellow, then disappeared, then spread across it again. And Maren sat there wrapped in the wool blanket, soaked through, hurting, hungry, and becoming acutely aware that she was inside a closed car, with a man whose name she didn't know, whose work she didn't know, and whose reason for stopping in the rain for a stranger she couldn't begin to understand. The part of her mind accustomed to working with numbers began listing possibilities, and not one of them was pleasant. "Who are you?" she asked. "The man who just offered you a job." "That's not an answer." "Tonight, it is," he said. "Ask me again tomorrow morning. I'll give you a fuller one." She studied his face from the side in the darkness, and she decided that if this was going to fall apart, it was better for it to fall apart now, while she was still only a few blocks from the sidewalk and didn't owe anyone anything. "I'm 5 months pregnant," she said. Her voice was flat, without pleading, and without apology. I'm telling you so you know before you decide. I'll be slower than other people. There'll be days when I have doctor's appointments. There'll be days when I'm tired. If that's a problem, let me out at the next intersection. I won't be angry. He didn't hesitate at all. I'm hiring your mind, he said, not your belly. Maren turned her face toward the window. Outside, the harbor slid past through the veil of condensation, the black shapes of cranes and stacked shipping containers rising over one another, like another city pressing down on this one. She watched them and felt something she had believed, for the past 4 months, that she was no longer capable of feeling. Not hope. She was nowhere near ready to risk that. Just a silence inside herself. The kind of silence that comes when someone has stood too long before a locked door and suddenly hears the bolt begin to turn. She kept pressing the handkerchief against her knee, and she never realized that for the rest of the drive, the man beside her didn't take his eyes off the road even once, because he didn't dare look at her again. The car didn't turn toward the neighborhoods where the lights were. It turned downward instead, heading back toward the water, and Maren realized it when the smell in the air changed, when the scent of engine oil and salt and wet timber began slipping through the cracks around the doors. She didn't ask. She had learned very early in life that people only asked questions when they still had choices, and tonight she had none. The dock gate opened in front of the car without anyone having to sound the horn. Then strange things began to happen. A crane lowering its hook into the hold of a ship suddenly stopped midway, the cable swaying in the rain, and it remained suspended there until the car had passed completely. 4 men in reflective jackets, standing beside a stack of pallets, all took off their caps at the same time, without anyone telling them to, without any of them looking directly at the car. A little farther on, a man wearing a coat with a harbor authority badge was writing on a clipboard. He looked up, saw the car, then immediately turned and walked in the opposite direction, as though he'd just remembered some urgent business at the far end of the dock. Maren sat motionless beneath the wool blanket and felt a different kind of cold, nothing like the cold of wet clothes, begin crawling slowly along her spine. The car stopped. A broad-shouldered man with closely cropped hair was already waiting beneath a corrugated metal awning. He opened the door for the man in the black coat, then stepped back exactly half a pace behind his left shoulder. No one introduced anyone. Maren only heard the man in the black coat call him Cassius. Then came the sound of shoes running over wet concrete, and a man somewhere past 50, wearing a plastic raincoat torn at one shoulder, rushed toward them and stopped several steps away, both hands raised to chest level, in a posture Maren had seen before on men who came to face their creditors. He spoke very quickly, his voice breaking halfway through his sentences, about a delayed shipment, about the bank, about his wife waiting at home, about 4 overdue dock fees that he swore he would pay, swore on everything he had. The man in the black coat listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't frown. He stood there in the rain with both hands resting quietly in his pockets. And when the other man had finished, he merely tilted his head slightly toward Cassius and spoke in the same calm tone someone might use to ask the time. Cut the refrigerator Podema to hold 2. The man in the raincoat went completely still. Cassius didn't ask him to repeat it, didn't nod, simply took out his phone. There are 40 tons of cargo in there, the man in the raincoat said, and by then his voice had almost disappeared. I know what's in there, the man in the black coat said. So do you. That's why next time you'll pay on time. Then he turned his back on the man, and in the exact moment he turned, something in his face softened, so quickly that Maren almost thought she'd imagined it. He opened the car door and bent down to look inside. Are you cold? He asked, and now his voice belonged to an entirely different man. The same voice that had told her on the sidewalk that those 3 steps were hers to take. Maren looked at him. Then she looked over his shoulder at the man in the raincoat, still standing motionless on the dock in the rain, then back at him again. I understand now, she said. You don't understand all of it yet, he said, but you understand enough to decide. He straightened, one hand still holding the door. The car door isn't locked. It never was. You tell me where you want to get out, and I'll let you out there, and I won't come looking for you again. Or you can stay where you are. But if you stay, then you need to stay because you saw what just happened, not because you didn't. Maren was silent for a very long time. She thought about the $3.40 lying in the puddle. She thought about 30 job applications with not a single reply. She thought about the feeling she'd had that morning while standing in the public bathroom at the bus terminal and realizing she had nowhere left to go. Then she placed one hand over her belly. Are you going to do anything that could hurt the baby? She asked. No. Then keep driving. The apartment was on the top floor of an old warehouse that had been converted, and when the lights came on, Marin stood in the doorway for a long moment without stepping inside. The dark oak floor stretched so wide that footsteps echoed across it. One entire wall was made of glass from floor to ceiling, looking straight out over the harbor and the scattered yellow lights lining the edge of the water. There were no curtains, no rugs, and the thing that caught her attention most, the thing she registered in exactly the same way she would have registered an unbalanced ledger, was that there wasn't a single photograph on any of those walls. No wedding pictures, no photographs of parents, no photographs of friends, not one human face anywhere. In the corner stood a dark wood liquor cabinet filled with expensive bottles, and a thin, perfectly even layer of dust rested across the shoulder of every one. The man placed 4 thick stacks of files on the dining table, each already tied with string, as though they'd been waiting there since before he'd stepped out into the rain. 4 companies, he said. Warehousing, dock leasing, equipment maintenance, and logistics. Full books for the last 2 years. You read every set, cross-check them, and tell me what doesn't match. Marin looked at the 4 stacks of paper. And the 5th set, she said. It wasn't a question, just an observation. The observation of someone accustomed to counting. The man didn't blink. There is a 5th set, he said. You'll never see it, never hear it mentioned, and never ask about it. If you ask, you're out that same day. No explanation, no argument. Understood? Understood. You're not curious? Marin pulled the first stack of files toward herself and untied the string. You're paying me to read numbers, she said, not to be curious. She untied the second length of string, arranged the 4 stacks of files in a straight row across the table in front of her, and then she disappeared. Emmett Castellane had watched many people sit down in front of ledgers over the course of his life. Accountants in expensive suits, auditors paid by the hour, and every one of them did the work in more or less the same way. They read. They punched numbers into calculators. Every so often, they looked up to see whether the man paying them seemed satisfied. The woman sitting at his dining table did none of those things. She opened the first stack, lowered her head, and although her body remained exactly where it was, the rest of her seemed to leave the room. She didn't ask him a single question. She didn't take one sip of the coffee he'd placed beside her elbow. She turned the pages at a strangely steady rhythm, neither fast nor slow, sometimes stopping at one page before moving on again, and he realized she wasn't reading line by line. She was reading in blocks, the way someone could look at a brick wall and know immediately which brick had been laid crooked, without having to count every brick in the wall. Her hair was still damp. Her left leg was stretched straight beneath the table because her knee wouldn't bend. Outside, the rain had eased, and the harbor had settled into the heavy stillness of the late-night hours, while Emmett stood leaning against the kitchen cabinet with his arms folded across his chest, doing nothing but watching. The coffee pot wasn't empty yet when she spoke. Here, he stepped closer. She had opened 2 pages and laid them side by side, one from the stack on the left and one from the stack on the right, and she placed the tip of her pencil on a line near the middle. 3rd quarter container settlement, she said. This is the number of dockings you recorded. This is the money that came in. Do you see anything? I see a number. You see a number that's a little low, she said, and you'd assume business was slow that season. Anyone would, but this isn't a rounding error. Rounding errors scatter. Sometimes they're over, sometimes they're under. This doesn't. This is short by exactly enough to make that quarter look like a bad quarter, instead of a quarter that was being skimmed. She turned 3 more pages, laid them down, and lightly tapped the tip of her pencil against each place. 3 more times, spread over 2 years. Same pattern, same method of hiding it. Different numbers, but exactly the same proportion. Emmett placed both hands on the edge of the table and bent over to look. 4 lines, 4 numbers. He had seen these pages before. He himself had sat in that very chair and turned through them as casually as an old newspaper. The person doing this isn't greedy, Marin said. That's the frightening part. A greedy person takes a large amount and disappears, and everyone notices within a month. This person takes a little at a time, steadily, over 2 years, and always takes exactly the amount that, when it's missing, looks like the market dipped instead of like someone stole it. She looked up at him. This person isn't afraid of getting caught. This person is only afraid of being noticed. Those are 2 completely different things, and the second kind is much more dangerous. The room remained silent for a long time. Then Emmett said a name, and he said it very quietly, the way people said the name of someone they were still trying not to think about. Gideon Pryor. Marin didn't ask who he was. She waited. He kept my books for 4 years, Emmett said. He left last summer, said he was going to work for a fund out of state. I even sent someone to his house with a gift the day he left. He straightened, walked to the glass wall, and stood there with his back to her. I suspected 3 people outside. I had all 3 watched. Not once did I suspect anyone inside my own house. That's exactly why they were able to use someone inside your house, she said. He didn't turn around, but she saw one small movement pass through his shoulders. You can't blame yourself for that, she continued, and there was no softness in her voice, no attempt to comfort him. No one checks the lock on their own bedroom door. They only check the front door. She worked for a long time after that. And when she finally stood, her left knee had stiffened so badly that she had to brace one hand against the back of the chair. She walked down the hallway toward the room he'd shown her, and when she passed the study door, which had been left slightly open, she glanced inside out of reflex. Emmett was sitting at the desk. There were no papers in front of him, no phone. In his hand was a wrench. It was old and dark, the handle worn smooth and polished, exactly where a person's thumb would naturally rest, the kind of wear that only decades of use could create. He wasn't repairing anything. He was simply holding it, turning it slowly in his palm, looking at it the way someone might look at a letter they had long since memorized. Then he opened the top drawer on the right, placed the wrench inside, closed it, and turned the key in the lock. Maren kept walking. She didn't ask. In her room, she sat down on the edge of the bed and took from the bottom of her canvas bag the only thing she still carried from her old life. A small leather-bound notebook with all 4 corners worn down. She opened to the first page. The ballpoint handwriting leaned slightly to one side, written by the hand of a man more accustomed to holding tools than a pen. People can lie to you. A balance sheet can't. Read both, Maren. She read the line 3 times, as she always did. Then she closed the notebook. She had never turned past the first page. She didn't tonight either. 3 weeks later, the penthouse smelled of coffee from early morning, and the rustle of paper continued until late at night. And the long oak dining table had stopped being a dining table a long time ago. Maren had gone through all 4 sets of records twice, and by the second pass, she had started doing something no one had hired her to do. She was cleaning, not cleaning to make things neat, cleaning the way an auditor cleaned, which meant pulling everything out of everywhere, because in her life, the most important thing had never once been found in the drawer with the proper label on it. That afternoon, she was working through the low shelf in the study, the one holding old insurance records for the 4 companies, thick files that clearly hadn't been opened in years. She pulled down the 6th file, rested it on her lap, and a sheet of paper slipped from the edge of the folder and fell to the floor. She picked it up, and the moment her fingers touched it, she knew something was wrong. The paper was thick, textured stock with raised letterhead, the kind ordered specially for rooms with deep carpets on high floors. It didn't look like any other sheet of paper in the apartment. Didn't look like anything in the 4 sets of records. Didn't look like anything that belonged in a converted warehouse at the edge of the water. She read it. There were only a few lines. The arrangement as proposed is acceptable. Quarterly transfers as discussed. Warehouse lot number 9 remains the priority. No attention is to be drawn until the survey is complete. Beneath that were 2 handwritten initials, slanted and decisive. S and R. Maren didn't stand up. She lowered herself all the way to the floor where she'd been kneeling, her back against the edge of the shelf, and stared at the paper in her hand for a very long time without being able to form a single clear thought. When Emmett came in, he found her sitting there on the floor among the opened files, a sheet of paper in her hand and one leg stretched straight out. He didn't ask what she was doing down there. He didn't tell her to get up. He walked over and crouched directly in front of her, at eye level, exactly the way he'd done once before in a rainstorm neither of them had mentioned since. "Let me see," he said. She handed him the paper. He read it, and Maren saw the moment those 2 initials entered him. The tiny tightening around his eyes, the sudden stillness of a man who had just heard his own name called from the next room. "You know him," she said. Emmett stood. He walked to the glass wall and stayed there with his back to her, and she left him alone, because she'd come to understand that some information required a space between receiving it and answering it. "Sterling Renshaw," he said. She had never heard the name before, but the way he said it, flat, slow, almost careful, told her enough about its weight. "Who is he?" "Chairman of a corporation downtown." Emmett turned around. "His name is on a wing of a children's hospital. He has dinner with the mayor. For the last 4 years, he's been buying land along the eastern waterfront." He walked to the table, spread out a map of the harbor, and placed 3 fingertips on 3 points. These 3 parcels changed hands over the last 2 years. All 3 previous owners said they sold voluntarily. I know 2 of them personally. Neither one wanted to leave. Maren pushed herself upright, walked over, and bent down over the map. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, then placed her finger on the empty space between those 3 points. Connect them and they make one strip, she said. A corridor running all the way from the east side to deep water. And here, right where the line breaks. What's this? Emmett looked down. Warehouse number 9. Late that afternoon, Sabine Trawick arrived. She had kept the books for 4 docks for 30 years. A woman with short silver hair, low-heeled shoes, and so few words that every sentence she spoke felt as though it had been weighed before she allowed it out. She brought the monthly reports, set them on the table, and exchanged a few brief words with Emmett about the crane maintenance schedule. Then she turned to leave, and her eyes passed over the corner of the table where Marin worked. There, beside a stack of papers, lay a faded cotton handkerchief, folded into quarters, with a few embroidered stitches in one corner. Sabine Trawick stopped. No one noticed except Marin, and Marin only noticed because she happened to be looking up. The woman didn't cry out, didn't ask a question, didn't change a single feature of her face. She simply stood still, perfectly still, and all the blood drained from her face in the space of one breath. Then she said goodbye, her voice still perfectly normal, and walked out. That night, Emmett's phone rang very late. He looked at the name on the screen and answered. The person on the other end said exactly one sentence. Before he could reply, the call ended. Marin, sitting at the dining table beneath the only desk lamp still burning, looked up. Emmett said nothing. He placed the phone on the table, walked to the glass wall, and stood there staring out over the harbor for a very long time, so long that she finished reconciling 2 full pages, and he still hadn't moved. The meeting of the 4 docks took place in the back room of the old operations building, where there was a long pine table and 4 chairs worn so smooth that much of the paint had disappeared. Marin hadn't been invited, and she hadn't intended to attend, but Emmett told her to bring the reconciliation sheets, and he said it in a voice that left no room for refusal. She sat at the end of the table beside her stack of papers, and she counted exactly 3 seconds from the moment she sat down to the moment the salt and pepper-haired man across from her began to speak. Rourke Delahaye had run the North Dock since Emmett's father was still alive. He had the way of sitting that belonged to a man accustomed to occupying an entire chair, both broad hands planted flat on the table, and he didn't look at Marin once while speaking about her. I want to say this plainly, and I'm saying it in front of her instead of behind her back, he said to Emmett. You brought a stranger in to read the complete books of 4 companies, someone whose face you didn't even know 3 weeks ago, a pregnant woman with no references, no one to vouch for her, picked up off the street on a rainy night. Sabine Trawick sat silently on the other side of the table, never lifting her eyes from the report in front of her. Cassius leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded. Your father would never have done that, Rourke said. Not in 1,000 years. Emmett let the words remain in the room for a moment. Then he said, My father also would never have let 20 months of money disappear into the hands of his own accountant. No one moved. He died without knowing he'd been hollowed out from the inside. Emmett continued, still in that same even voice. I know every amount, every quarter, every method used to hide it. I know because of her. Rourke looked at him for a long time. Then he pushed his chair back, stood, and became the first man to leave the room. But at the doorway, he paused for half a beat, turned his head, and looked toward Marin. Just one glance, brief, and there was none of the contempt she'd prepared herself to receive. There was something else in it, something she couldn't read. And because she couldn't read it, she remembered it. The second man came on Thursday afternoon, and Marin saw him through the window before he knocked. His car was parked in the yard below, an expensive charcoal sedan, and she noticed that exhaust was still flowing steadily from the tailpipe. He hadn't turned off the engine. She registered that in exactly the same way she registered a line out of place on a balance sheet. A man who left his engine running didn't intend to stay long, and a man who didn't intend to stay long hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to deliver a message. He introduced himself as Prescott Lyle, Director of Acquisitions, wearing a light wool coat, a heavy watch, and offering the kind of handshake that was firmer than necessary. He spoke about a client interested in waterfront property. He named a figure. It was 3 times the market value of the parcel, and he said it in the voice of a man who believed the number itself had already ended the conversation. I'm not selling, Emmett said. You haven't heard the entire offer. It won't change my answer. Lyle smiled, the practiced kind of smile. Mr. Castellane, I'm saying this in good faith. With your profit margins over the last 20 months, an amount like this. He stopped, but it was too late. The room changed. Marin sat still at the corner of the table and felt the air grow dense. My profit margins, Emmett said very quietly, over the last 20 months. A general market assessment. You didn't say general assessment, Emmett said. You said 20 months. Where did you get that number? Prescott Lyle didn't answer. He buttoned his coat again, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the door with exactly the easy composure of a man who knew his car was still running outside. At the threshold, he gave them one final sentence. This parcel is going to change hands, Mr. Castellane. The only question left is how. 3 days later, the freight carrier that still handled shipments for Lyle's company informed him that it no longer had capacity to accept his orders for the current quarter. His bank sent a courteous letter stating that his line of credit was being reviewed as part of a routine process. The club where he ate lunch every Tuesday called to apologize because his membership had been temporarily suspended over a technical issue in his file. Marin learned about all of it that evening, when Cassius stopped by, delivered the report in 3 short sentences, and left. She waited until the door had closed before lifting her eyes from the reconciliation sheets. What did you do? Emmett poured water into a glass without turning around. Nothing, he said. I only reminded a few people who they owed. Human memory is a strange thing. It rearranges itself very quickly when you remind it in exactly the right place. On Monday morning, Emmett set the car keys on the table beside her coffee cup and said, Get your coat. She asked where they were going. He didn't answer. He drove through downtown, turned into a 4-story medical building with frosted glass doors, and when she saw the sign in the lobby, she understood, and she remained sitting in the car for a very long moment before opening the door. You didn't ask me, she said. If I'd asked, you would have said you didn't need it, he said. You haven't had a checkup in 4 months. I checked. You checked my medical records. I checked whether you'd paid for an appointment, he said. You haven't. That's all I needed to know. He didn't go inside with her. He stood in the hallway beside a window overlooking the parking lot, both hands in his pockets, and he stayed there the entire morning. Inside, the examination room was dark and cool, and the technician was a woman with warm hands and the voice of someone who had done this thousands of times. She spread gel across Marin's belly, moved the probe, watched the screen, then moved it again. There was the faint static of the machine, the sound of Marin's own breathing, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Then the woman turned a knob, and the room filled with beating. It was fast, twice as fast as an adult heart, so fast it sounded like someone running across a wooden floor, and it never missed a beat. It just kept beating, steady, strong, stubborn, filling that little room from floor to ceiling, asking no one's permission, caring nothing that the woman carrying it had sent out 30 job applications without receiving a single reply, had sold her car, had slept at a bus terminal, had sat in a puddle outside a grocery store with $3.40. It simply beat. And Marin Aldridge, who hadn't cried when she lost her job, hadn't cried when the man in her life closed the door and left, hadn't cried when her landlord changed the locks, hadn't cried beneath the November rain, while 7 people turned their faces away, lay on that examination table in the darkness, and began to cry. She lifted both hands and covered her face. The technician didn't say anything. She simply held the probe where it was, keeping that sound in the room far longer than was professionally necessary. And it was the kindest thing a stranger had done for Marin in months. When Marin stepped back into the hallway, her eyes were dry and her face had returned to normal. Emmett turned from the window. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, then nodded, and he didn't ask a single question. On the drive back, the car crossed the west side, and the traffic light at the first intersection turned red. Why did you do this? She asked. He didn't answer. The light turned green. The second intersection. Still no answer. At the third intersection, the car stopped behind a bus, and he stared straight through the windshield as he spoke. Because 15 years ago, someone did this for me. She waited. He didn't say anything else. 3 days later, the lawyer arrived. He rang from the lobby in the middle of the morning, introduced himself as Alden Ferris, wore a well-fitted gray suit, carried a soft leather document case, and had the rigid courtesy of a man who had served a great many unpleasant papers and had learned how not to become attached to any of them. He didn't sit down. He took out a stapled packet of papers and held it toward Emmett. I represent a trust company registered in this state. I'm required to notify you of a civil claim involving an unpaid loan in the amount of $340,000. Emmett didn't reach for it. Marin stood up from the table and took the packet. She read. Emmett looked at Ferris. Ferris looked at the window. In less than 2 minutes, she looked up. This loan agreement is dated 4 years ago, she said. The borrower is Emmett Castellane. The notarizing witness is Hollis Marsh, from the corner store on Wharfline. She placed the papers on the table, turned them around so Forrest could see, and put her finger on the signature at the bottom of the page. Do you have the original? A certified copy. That's better for you, she said. She walked to the file shelf, pulled out a thin folder she'd reorganized 2 weeks earlier, opened it to a page, and laid it beside the other document. This is a notice declining participation in a stormwater drainage agreement that Mr. Castellane signed and submitted to the neighborhood council. It's a public document. Anyone can request a copy. She placed the 2 signatures side by side. Look, same slant, same spacing between the letters. And here, on the 3rd letter, the ink breaks in exactly the same place, because the pen tip caught. Faris bent down. He stayed bent over the documents longer than he wanted to. A person's signatures are never absolutely identical, Marin said, not even their own. Sign your name 10 times and you'll get 10 different signatures. A little farther off here, a little heavier there. 2 signatures that are identical, down to the exact place where the ink breaks aren't 2 signatures. They're 1 signature copied twice. She looked up. This isn't forgery, Mr. Faris. Forgery is when someone sits down and practices until they can imitate a signature. This is a transfer. Someone took a real signature from a real document and transferred it onto another one. The room went silent. Ferris buttoned his suit jacket again. I'm only serving the papers, he said. I know, Marin said, and her voice softened completely, becoming almost kind. You've done the job someone paid you to do. No one blames you for that. She pushed the packet back toward him. But on your way back, you'll have a fairly long drive to answer one question for yourself. When this file reaches court, and it will reach court, what do you want your name recorded there as? A participant, or the man who stepped away the moment he learned the truth? Alden Ferris picked up his case. He didn't say goodbye to anyone, but at the doorway, he stopped for exactly 1 beat, just as Rourke Delahaye had stopped, and Marin wondered why men seemed to keep stopping at the threshold of her home that week. The name of the trust company in the lawsuit haunted her all that night, not because it was unfamiliar, because it was familiar. Marin stayed at the dining table after Emmett had gone to bed, pulled the lamp down low, and began doing the things she had done every day for 6 years, before the world closed its doors on her, tracing a name backward through layer after layer of paperwork until she reached the bottom. The trust company named in the lawsuit was owned by an asset management company. That asset management company had 3 corporate shareholders. One of those 3 entities was registered at the same address as an infrastructure investment fund, and that infrastructure fund, when she turned to the final page of the corporate extract, sat beneath the name of a conglomerate she had first seen only a few days earlier, on a harbor map with 3 fingertips resting on it. Renshaw Meridian. She sat up straight. Then she did something she had avoided for 4 months. She took out her own personal file, the one she still kept at the bottom of her canvas bag beside the leather-bound notebook, and opened it. Employment contract, appointment letter, and the termination notice. 1 page, 4 lines, no reason given. She read the name of her former company. Then she looked it up, and she sat perfectly still for a very long time when the result appeared on the screen. Because the independent auditing firm where she had worked for 6 years, the place she had once believed was neutral, the place she had once been proud of, because it belonged to no one, turned out to be a subsidiary buried inside the very same chain of ownership. It belonged to Renshaw Meridian, too. The next morning, she laid it all out for Emmett in 10 minutes, without wasting a single sentence. And he listened to every word without interrupting her once. So he was targeting you from the beginning, he said. No, Marin said. That's exactly where I was wrong. She opened the file. Sterling Renshaw doesn't know who I am. He has no reason to know. I was a mid-level auditor at a subsidiary 4 layers beneath him. A man like that doesn't personally deal with someone like me. He doesn't even look that far down. Then who? She placed on the table the document she had pulled from the bottom of her personal file. The document she had never shown anyone. The document that had cost her her job. 4 months ago, I was assigned to review a consolidated cash flow report for a corporate client. I refused to sign off on it. There were 7 intercompany transfers whose sources I couldn't trace, and I stated clearly in the review notes that I couldn't certify their accuracy. She pushed the paper toward him. 3 days later, I was fired. No reason. Emmett looked down. In the upper right corner of the review sheet, inside the box, marked for the client's approving officer, a name was printed in bold. Gideon Pryor. He said nothing. He stood up, took 2 steps, then stopped in the middle of the room. Those 7 transfers, Marin said. Now I know what they were. I was looking directly at the money he skimmed from your 4 companies, washed through 3 layers, then routed toward Renshaw Meridian. That report was what made the entire thing look legitimate. It needed the signature of an independent auditor to become valid. She looked up at him, and that signature was supposed to be mine. The room went completely silent. I didn't know what I was looking at. she said. I only saw 7 numbers whose sources I couldn't trace, and I did exactly what my father taught me to do. I didn't sign. I didn't even understand what I'd just stopped. Emmett turned back toward her. So he erased you. He had to erase me, she said. An auditor who refuses to sign stays dangerous as long as she remembers why she refused. The cheapest way to deal with that isn't to buy her off. It's to make sure no one believes her anymore. She turned the file to the last page, where 30 lines had been written by hand, 30 company names, 30 dates, and not one line with a note showing any response. 30 job applications in 4 months, she said. Not one place answered. Not one place rejected me. Just silence. I sat in the bus terminal bathroom wondering whether there was something wrong with me that I didn't know about. She closed the file. There wasn't anything wrong with me. Someone just made the phone call before I did. And Marin Aldridge sat motionless in the penthouse overlooking the harbor, finally understanding that the day she knelt in a puddle outside Hollis Marsh's store had not been the day bad luck found her. It was the day the bill came due. That November rain had never been an accident. It was the consequence of a signature she had refused to put on the page. He came on a Friday afternoon, and the guard downstairs called up to ask whether she would receive a man named Dorian Vale. Marin stood beside the dining table with the receiver pressed to her ear, and needed about 5 seconds to remember that it was the name she had once written in the emergency contact section of her hospital paperwork. Send him up, she said. He walked in, and she knew immediately that something didn't fit. And the part of her mind that had always counted things began counting before her emotions had time to speak. New coat, new shoes, the kind with stitched soles instead of glued ones, hair cut at a place where they charged by the appointment rather than by the trim. He stood in the middle of the penthouse, looked around at the oak floor and the glass wall overlooking the harbor, then turned back to her, looked down at her belly, and arranged his face into the gentle expression she had believed for 2 years. I've been looking everywhere for you, he said. I know what you think. I know I was a coward then, but I haven't been able to sleep, Marin. Not one night. She didn't invite him to sit. Go home. Just hear me out. He stepped 1 pace closer. I didn't come because of you. I came because of the baby. It needs a father. I don't want my child growing up asking where its father is, and no one being able to answer. And while he said that, he lifted a hand to smooth his hair. His cuff slipped back, and Marin saw the watch. It was heavy, with a dark face and a woven metal bracelet, the kind of watch no one ever bought by mistake. She had stood beside him in a store on the very last day they were together, and she remembered exactly how he'd looked into the display case and then turned away. Remembered exactly what he'd said, that a watch like that would take 2 years of salary before he could even think about it. She looked at the watch, then she looked at his face. How much? She asked. He stopped. How much what? How much did they pay you to disappear from my life? She said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It simply went flat. The flatness of someone reading a line aloud from a balance sheet. I'm not asking so I can blame you. I'm asking because this is what I do. I've spent 4 months wondering why everything collapsed in the same week. I lost my job, lost my home, lost you. All 3 within 9 days. I kept thinking I was unlucky. Now I know it was a planned expense. She placed one hand over her belly. So I want to know the number. How much were my child and I worth on their balance sheet? Dorian Vale opened his mouth. Nothing came out. From the doorway of the study, Emmett stepped into the room. He didn't move quickly. He didn't roll up his sleeves, didn't clench his hands, didn't come more than 3 steps closer. He stopped at a polite distance, both hands still in his trouser pockets, and spoke in the same calm voice he used when asking the time. Dorian Vale, you're currently working as a market development consultant for a brokerage firm with offices on the 9th floor of a building on Congress Street. You took that position 4 months ago, without recruitment, without an interview. Your salary checks are signed by the finance department, but the initial payment isn't listed under payroll. It's recorded under irregular consulting expenses, and the person who approved it has the initials G and P. He paused for 1 beat. I'm not adding anything. I'm only reading back to you what's already there on paper. Dorian looked at him. Then he looked at Marin. Then he looked down at the watch on his wrist, as though it had suddenly appeared there, and he pulled his sleeve down over it with the awkward movement of someone who had just been caught. Marin, he said. Go home, she said. He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stumbled slightly and had to reach out to steady himself against the frame, and the sound of the elevator doors closing behind him was the cleanest sound Marin had heard in months. She stood perfectly still for a long time. Are you all right? Emmett asked. No, she said, but I will be. That much I know for certain. She couldn't sleep that night, not because of Dorian. She had filed him away in exactly the same place where she put every account that had already been settled, and she had no intention of opening that file again. She lay there listening to the silence of the old warehouse building, the faint clicking of water inside the pipes, the distant sound of a ship horn carrying up from the harbor, and after a while she sat up and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. All the hallway lights were off, but a thin strip of yellow light showed beneath the study door, the door itself open about the width of a hand, and there was a voice speaking inside. She meant to keep walking. She truly did. Then she heard that voice, and her feet stopped before she had time to decide. It was Emmett Castellane's voice, but it wasn't the voice that had asked whether she was cold in the car, wasn't the voice that had told her those 3 steps were hers, and it wasn't the voice that had recited the name of a brokerage firm on Congress Street to a trembling man. It was lower than all of those voices. There was no warmth in it at all. It was the voice people used when everything had already been decided a long time ago, and the call itself was nothing more than a formality. "No," he said. Then there was a long silence. "I heard you. I'm still saying no." Another silence. "Listen to me carefully. Don't touch it. Not today. Not next month. Not whenever you decide it's convenient." A pause. "Because if I allow anyone to touch it, then I'll have to open a list. And both you and I know exactly whose name is sitting directly beneath it, on that list." Marin stood frozen in the middle of the hallway. "You think I've gone soft," he said. "Think that if it makes you feel better. But I sat down in this chair when I was 24 years old. And you know why it was empty then. Don't make me remind you." There was the sound of a phone being set down on the desk, then the scrape of a chair moving back. Emmett walked over and pulled the door fully open, and he saw her standing there with the glass of water in her hand. Neither of them spoke for an uncomfortably long time. She had already prepared herself for him to close the door again and tell her this had nothing to do with her. She had prepared herself for him to say she'd misunderstood what she heard. He did neither. He simply looked at her and said, "How much did you hear?" "Enough." He nodded once. Then he walked to the glass wall and stood there facing the harbor, and he spoke without turning around. "I'm not going to lie to you and tell you I'm a good man. I'm not. Things have happened around this harbor that, if you knew about them, might make you unwilling to sit at the same table with me again. And I wouldn't blame you for that." He turned around. "But I will tell you one thing. Once. And then you can decide for yourself." He looked at her, and his gaze dropped, pausing for the briefest moment where her hand rested over her belly, then returned to her face. "The day I took this chair, I made one rule. The first rule. Before everything else. No women. No children. Ever. For any reason." He continued, his voice still flat. "It's cost me money. It's cost me 2 major contracts. There are people in this organization who think it's a weakness, and they've thought that for 10 years. I know they do. I haven't changed the rule." Marin stood perfectly still. She could feel her heart beating in her throat, and she realized that for the first time since that rainy night, she was afraid of this man. Not afraid of what he might do to her. Afraid in the way people were afraid when they stood too close to something enormous and very still. "And the people who aren't women," she said, "and aren't children." Emmett didn't answer. He didn't look away from her. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He simply stood there and let the silence stretch between them until it had said everything it needed to say. And that was the answer. Marin looked at him for another moment. Then she set the glass of water down on the shelf. "Thank you for not lying to me," she said. "Go to bed," he said. "Tomorrow morning we need to talk about warehouse lot number 9. The original records weren't kept in the penthouse. Marin had asked for them to be moved the very day Prescott Lyle mentioned 20 months, and Emmett had taken them to Walter Fenwick, a 70-year-old man who built wooden boats at the southern edge of the harbor, a man who had known Emmett's father since the days when both of them hauled fishing nets for wages, a man who owed nothing to anyone and kept out of everyone else's business. On Tuesday morning, an old pickup truck braked hard in front of the warehouse building, and Margot Fenwick jumped out, her hair plastered down by the rain. Walter's 33-year-old daughter-in-law, her voice still unsteady from the drive. "They came this morning," she said. 3 men. In suits. Rental car. Cassius opened the yard gate for her. Marin stood on the steps with a stack of papers still in her hands. "They showed us a document," Margot said. "It had a seal. Signatures. Looked real. Said it was in order to recover corporate property being unlawfully withheld. My father-in-law asked what property, and they said stolen accounting records." She wiped her face with her sleeve. "They searched everything. The workshop, the lumber shed, the paint room, even his tool cabinet. They didn't break anything. I have to be fair about that. They were very orderly, like people doing inventory." "Did they get anything?" Emmett asked. "No," Margot said. "The old man took the package down to the coal cellar beneath the old house himself the night before. He didn't tell anyone. Not even me. I only found out this morning. Marin let out a breath. Why did he do that? He said the neighbor's dog had been barking at the wrong hour all week. Margot said. He said when you've lived by the water for 70 years, you know when strangers have been passing through. The entire yard remained silent for several beats. Then Margot continued, lowering her voice. There's one more thing. When they reached the door, my father-in-law asked for their names. The old man told them that if they were acting under the law, then they had to tell him who they were. The man in charge turned around, smiled very politely, and said, She stopped. He said his name was Pryor. No one spoke. Cassius looked at Emmett. Emmett didn't move, but Marin saw his knuckles tighten and then release. The exact same movement she'd seen on the steering wheel during that first rainy night. He did it deliberately, she said. He didn't need to hide his name. He gave it because he wanted us to know he'd come back. That same week, they moved the originals a second time, and the person carrying them was Ellis Merrick, Gus's nephew, 24 years old, who had been driving for the docks since he was 18, the kind of young man who still addressed every woman older than himself as ma'am. Marin gave him his instructions in the parking lot beneath a sheet metal roof while the rain drummed overhead. Listen to me carefully, she said. If anyone stops you and demands this briefcase, you give it to them. Ellis looked at her. But ma'am, give it to them, she said. Don't argue. Don't struggle. Don't look anyone directly in the face. Keep your hands on the steering wheel. Tell them you're only the driver, and hand over the case. What about the records? The records are paper, Marin said. You aren't. He left while it was still dark. It rained along the coastal road that day, the kind of late-season rain that wasn't heavy but never stopped, the windshield wipers moving steadily back and forth, the sea on his left as gray as tin. About 2/3 of the way there, Ellis looked into the rearview mirror and saw a dark car staying behind him longer than it should have. Then a second car pulled ahead of him. The one in front slowed down. The one behind moved close, and he was forced onto the shoulder in the space of one long breath. No one honked. No one shouted. That was what sent the coldest feeling down his spine. There was the sound of a car door opening, shoes striking wet pavement. Then a figure stopped beside the driver's window, and the person simply stood there without speaking, letting the rain hammering against the roof do all the work. Ellis placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. He stared straight down at the speedometer. I'm only the driver, he said. The window lowered partway. He lifted the leather briefcase from the passenger seat and held it outside. A gloved hand took it. The footsteps turned away. A door closed. Both cars pulled away from the shoulder, and in less than a minute the coastal road held nothing but rain and the steady sound of the windshield wipers again. Ellis Merrick sat motionless inside the car for a very long time. Then he opened the door, walked to the back, opened the trunk, removed the floor panel, and pulled a phone wrapped in a plastic bag from inside the spare tire. His hands were shaking so badly that he had to try 3 times before the screen came on. But the thing that mattered was still there. The entire set of records, photographed one page at a time, had already been sent from a gas station 20 miles behind him, before daylight. The following weekend, the sky finally cleared, one of those rare stretches of late sunshine the coast sometimes gave away for free in the middle of the cold season, and Marin went back to the boatyard with Margot to collect signatures, confirming several storage records. The yard behind the workshop was covered with wood shavings, pale cream curls scattered across the concrete, and the smell of pine resin warmed beneath the sun until it became something sweet and dry in the air. She sat down on a bench beside the brick wall, stretched out her left leg, and closed her eyes for a while. When she opened them again, there was a little girl standing in front of her, 6 years old, hair tied into 2 pigtails, wearing a red sweater much too large for her, both arms wrapped around a stack of old drawing paper. June Fenwick. The girl didn't say hello. She simply held out the stack of paper and said, Do you know how to fold a boat? I think I've forgotten. Then I'll teach you. The girl climbed onto the bench, sat close beside her, and began giving instructions with the solemn seriousness of someone passing down a family trade. She folded the paper in half, pressed it flat, then stopped and looked at Marin with an assessing expression. This is the most important part, she said. You have to press the edge really hard. Go over it again and again. If you cheat here, the water gets in, and then the boat sinks. Grandpa says boats don't sink because of the water. They sink because of the person who folded them. Marin pressed the crease with the edge of her thumbnail. Harder, June said. Marin pressed harder. The boat slowly took shape, crooked on one side, but it stood upright. June picked it up, turned it around to inspect it, then nodded with the generous approval of someone giving a passing grade. Then the girl set the stack of paper on her lap, turned toward Marin, and without asking permission, pressed her cheek against Marin's belly. She stayed like that for a while. "Can the baby hear me?" she asked. Marin looked down at the little pigtails glowing in the afternoon sunlight. "Yes," she said. "The baby can hear everything." "Really? Really?" June sat upright, her face lighting up. "Then I'm going to talk to the baby every day," she announced. "So when the baby comes out, the baby will already know me. We won't have to get to know each other all over again. Starting over is boring." And at that exact moment, beneath Marin's palm, there was a kick. Not a strong one, just a small nudge from inside. Once, and then nothing. She went completely still. June was already busy folding the second paper boat, and didn't notice a thing. That night, after all the lights in the building had gone dark, Marin sat on the edge of the bed and took out the leather-bound notebook. She opened to the first page and read her father's words in ballpoint pen again, just as she always did. Then she did something she had never done before. She turned to the second page, picked up a pen, and wrote a single line. "The baby kicked for the first time today, Dad." Adele Quist arrived at noon, a woman in her 50s wearing a faded field jacket and rubber boots, carrying a hard plastic case and a measuring instrument Marin didn't know the name of. She shook Emmett's hand, shook Marin's with exactly the same firmness, then asked for directions to warehouse number 9, and didn't say another word for the next 2 hours. She walked along the water's edge, with a measuring tape lowered over the side. She photographed the concrete footings, photographed the cross-section of the seawall, tapped 4 different places on the surface with a small hammer, and listened to the echo. She opened a paper notebook instead of using a tablet. By the time the sun began to sink, she returned to the operations building, set her case on the table, and spoke her first sentence of the entire afternoon. "Do either of you know what you're standing on?" Emmett didn't answer. 300 meters of uninterrupted waterfront, Adele Quist said. Natural depth, sufficient for ocean-going vessels, without additional dredging. The original foundation structure is still intact, the kind they haven't poured in a very long time. She turned a page in her notebook. "And a reserved deep-water berthing permit issued to this facility generations ago, never revoked." She placed a finger on the map she had spread across the table. "And this is the planned federal port expansion corridor awaiting approval. Look at it. It runs straight through here." Marin bent down to look. Adele Quist gave them a number. She said it in an ordinary voice, without emphasis, the way someone might read a meter. Emmett Castellane didn't move. He stood there with one hand resting on the edge of the table, and he said nothing for so long that Marin could clearly hear the clock on the wall. He had lived beside that warehouse his entire life. He had walked past it thousands of times. His father had taught him to tie mooring lines on that very stretch of concrete. "You're certain?" he asked. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Adele Quist said. "I don't give a number unless I'm willing to put my name under it." Marin straightened. Her voice was completely flat, without a trace of emotion. "Can you write the formal report tonight?" Adele Quist looked at her. "Tonight? Signed, with your license number. Dated," Marin said. "Not a draft, not a personal letter. A complete appraisal report, in proper form, ready to file." The other woman looked at her for another beat. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down. "Let me use this table," she said. "And coffee." That same night, the second thing happened. Cassius knocked on the penthouse door close to midnight, and Rourke Delahaye was standing behind him. Neither man took off his coat. Cassius placed 3 sheets of paper on the table. "For the past 3 weeks, I've been reviewing every communication going in and out of the 4 docks," he said. "I found the person talking to the outside." Emmett picked up the 3 pages. He read them. Then he set them down, and his face didn't change, but he read them a second time. "Gus Merrick," he said. Rourke sat in the chair across from him, his broad hands planted flat on the table in exactly the way he always sat. 18 years, he said. 18 years at this dock. He's had the key to warehouse number 9 since your father's time." Marin, sitting at the end of the table beside her stack of papers, said nothing. She was looking at the 3rd page in the set, the one Cassius had placed down last, and she recognized what it was immediately, because she'd seen hundreds of documents like it during her years in the profession. It wasn't a money transfer. It was a confirmation of the purchase of a receivable, a medical debt. The patient's name was Rosalie Merrick. The amount was so large that Marin had to look at it twice, and the buyer of that debt was an entity whose ownership chain she had memorized several nights earlier. "They didn't give him money," she said. All 3 men turned to look at her. "They bought his wife's hospital debt outright," Marin said. "Then they put this paper on the table in front of him. That's all. No offer, no threat, no promise of anything." She pushed the page toward Emmett. "One sheet of paper saying that from today on, the people who decide whether your wife gets to stay in the hospital are us." The room went silent. Cassius straightened, both hands hanging at his sides. And he looked at Emmett the way a man looked when waiting for an order they both already knew. Rourke Delahaye said, "You know the rule." Emmett didn't answer. "I didn't make that rule," Rourke continued. "It was here before me. It's been here since your grandfather's time. Someone inside the house talks to the outside. There's one way it's handled, and everyone on the docks knows what that way is. If you don't do it, within a week there'll be a second man testing you, then a third. You understand what I'm saying?" Emmett was still holding the paper. He looked down at it for a very long time. The name Rosalie Merrick. The amount. The date showing when the debt had been purchased. More than 2 years earlier. 2 years. Which meant that for 2 years, the man who held the key to warehouse number 9 had gone to work every morning with this sitting in a drawer at home, and hadn't said a word to anyone. "Cassius," Emmett said. "Yes, boss. Tomorrow, you go to the hospital. Pay it off. All of it, including the interest and the fees." He set the paper down on the table. "Then you take him home to his wife." Cassius didn't move. "Boss, I heard you. The rule is, that rule belonged to my father," Emmett said. He looked up, and his voice was as quiet as ever. So quiet that the entire room had to be silent to hear him. "My father is dead." Rourke Delahaye came the next morning, alone and without warning, and when Marin opened the door, she realized this was the first time she had ever been in the same room with the man without Emmett there. She left the door open. She stepped back once and positioned herself so that the dining table remained between them, and she did it with complete naturalness, the kind of naturalness that belonged to a woman who had learned long ago that where you stood mattered more than what you said. Rourke noticed. He didn't comment on it. He simply placed a thin file on the table, bound with a rubber band, its paper edges curled with age. "Open it." She did. Inside were sheets of graph paper, covered in handwriting. Dates clearly marked along the left margin, the script slanted and stiff. The handwriting of a man accustomed to scribbling quickly on the hood of a car. Date. Times entering and leaving the dock gates. The number of times Gus Merrick left the work area outside his shift. The names of 2 roadside diners. 1 license plate recorded 3 times on 3 different days. On the final page were 2 words. "Not enough," underlined twice. Marin turned back to the first page and checked the date. 6 months earlier. "You've been watching him since May," she said. "I've suspected him since May," Rourke said. "Suspecting isn't knowing. I don't go around talking when all I have is suspicion, because at this dock, 1 sentence spoken in the wrong place can end a man's life. I needed proof. For 6 months, I couldn't find any." He tipped his chin toward the stack of papers at her end of the table. "You did it in 3 weeks." She didn't know what to say. "I still think bringing you in here was a mistake," Rourke said. "I still think that. I don't change my mind because of one occasion." He picked up his hat. "But I was wrong. You should remember that, Miss Aldridge, because I say those words to very few people." Then he walked out, and this time he didn't stop at the threshold. That same afternoon, the letter arrived. It came by courier, not through the mail, delivered directly into the hands of the guard downstairs in a thick, embossed envelope, the same kind of paper Marin had held while sitting on the floor of the study. The message was brief. Its wording was so courteous that it became unpleasant. It was an invitation to a private lunch at the Writers' Club, to discuss several regrettable misunderstandings between reasonable businessmen, along with a reminder that matters like these always had a solution, less expensive than court. Beneath it was Sterling Renshaw's handwritten signature. "He wants to meet privately," Emmett said. "He wants you to go alone, to his place, and he wants no witnesses." Marin said, "You're not going." "No, but we are going to answer." She pulled a blank sheet of paper toward herself. She wrote briefly, not a single adjective, that the invitation had been received and declined, that the lawsuit based on the loan agreement was under review for the authenticity of the signature, that an independent appraisal report for the property had been completed, signed, dated, and issued under a professional license number, and was already making its way through the proper channels, that all future communication should be made in writing. Then she picked up the pen and signed it. Not Emmett Castellane's name. She signed her own, clearly, every letter complete. "Marin Aldridge, what are you doing?" Emmett said. "He spent money to erase my name from this profession." She folded the letter. "Now I'm sending it back to him." Sabine Trawick arrived early the next morning, before business hours, and she wasn't carrying the monthly reports. She stood in the middle of the penthouse with her handbag resting in both hands, looked at Emmett, then at Marin, and said, "I'm sorry I waited this long." Then she opened the bag, took out an envelope, and placed it on the oak table. All 4 edges had yellowed with age. It had never been opened. Across the front was a handwritten line in ballpoint pen, slightly slanted. the handwriting of someone more accustomed to holding tools than a pen. For my daughter, when she's old enough. Maren didn't touch it. I was the one who cleaned out the old man's safe after he died, Sabine said. I've kept the books for this family for 30 years, and that day I was the one with the key. There were papers in the safe, contracts, several things I turned over to the lawyers, and there was this. She looked down at the envelope. I didn't open it. I didn't give it to anyone either. All it said was my daughter. No name, no address. I didn't know which daughter. I didn't know who he was. She lifted her eyes to Maren. Not until the afternoon I walked into this room and saw the handkerchief on the corner of your table. Maren raised a hand to the pocket of her coat, where the handkerchief was still tucked away, and she couldn't say a word. I've seen that handkerchief once in my life, Sabine said. 15 years ago, I was the one behind the wheel that night. Emmett rose from his chair. He went into the study, and when he came back, there was a wrench in his hand. He placed it on the table beside the envelope, and Maren looked at the object lying there, dark with age, its handle worn smooth, exactly where a person's thumb would naturally rest. I was 19 that year, Emmett said. He didn't sit down. There was trouble in my family, the kind of trouble everyone would tell you came from the outside. But the man who gave the order that night wasn't an enemy of my family. He was my father's younger brother. He paused for one beat, then continued, and he never said another word about that man. I was hurt. I made it as far as Southie, and then I was done. I collapsed in the back lot of a repair shop on Dorchester Street, among a pile of old tires. And I lay there because I couldn't go any farther. The room was completely silent. There was an old mechanic inside the shop. He came out to lock up for the night, and he saw me, Emmett said. A normal man would have called an ambulance. A smart man would have shut the door and gone back inside. He did neither. He looked down at the wrench. He dragged me inside. He washed the wound with water from the basin he used to soak bolts. He bandaged me with a handkerchief from his own coat pocket, the one with those little embroidered stitches in the corner. Then he sat down on a stool beside me, and he stayed there all night. He looked up. He didn't ask my name, didn't ask whose son I was, didn't ask how I ended up like that, didn't ask who did it. The next morning, he gave me this. He tapped 2 fingers lightly against the wrench, so I could lean on it and make it to the end of the street. He said exactly one thing. Go on, son, and don't let me see you come back here this way again. Maren sat perfectly still. He knew whose son I was, Emmett said. He knew from the moment he pulled me inside. The next morning, he called my father. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a favor. He gave him exactly one condition. He looked directly into her eyes. I'm giving your son back to you. In return, you erase my daughter's name completely from your world. Never let her know that world exists. If I ever see her name appear in any of your papers, I'll go to the police myself. Sabine Trewick gave one small nod in confirmation. My father kept his word, Emmett said. He kept it absolutely. No file, no record, not a single line anywhere. For 15 years, I've been looking for a mechanic in Southie, and all I had was a shop that had closed and a name I was never allowed to know. I searched trade directories, tax records, business licenses. Nothing. My father had erased everything. He stood there with both hands hanging at his sides. I wasn't looking for you, Maren. I never knew there was a you. I spent 15 years looking for him because I wanted to settle a debt, and by the time I found him, he was already gone. He said the last sentence very quietly. Your father protected you by making you invisible, and that invisibility is the very thing that nearly killed you. Maren picked up the envelope. She opened it with her fingers, slowly, carefully, the way someone opens something that can never be opened a second time. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in half. 3 lines. The same ballpoint handwriting. The same hand. Only shakier. I'm sorry I kept you outside so many things. I thought that was protection. Now I understand I was only leaving you alone. Read both, Maren. The numbers and the people. And if the day ever comes when you have to choose the person who looks you straight in the eyes. She read that final line twice. Then she lifted her head and looked at the man who had crouched down to meet her at eye level in a November rain, before he'd had any chance to know who she was. That night, Cassius pulled nearly every available man to escort Adele Quist to the State Planning Board hearing, and only 4 people knew the schedule, all of them sitting in the back room of the old operations building when the decision was made. The penthouse was left with only Maren and the glow of the desk lamp. Before dawn, her phone vibrated. The name on the screen was Ellis. Miss Maren, I found Mr. Pryor's old safe. It's behind the sheet metal wall on the east side of warehouse number 9, hidden by the pallet racks. There's a notebook inside. I didn't dare touch it. Can you come down? I'll wait at the south door. Then the final line. Don't call me, please. I'm afraid my phone is being listened to, and it was that last line that stopped her from calling back. She picked up the car keys and went downstairs. The harbor road was deserted, the high lamps casting pools of yellow across the wet pavement. And when she turned into the lane leading to warehouse number 9, she smelled it before she saw it. Not the familiar smell of engine oil from the docks. Something else, scorched and sweet. The smell of burning pine. Smoke was rising from the pallet storage area at the western corner, thick and slow curling, creeping beneath the sheet metal roof before spilling downward. Maren got out of the car. She should have turned around. But the original records were inside the steel cabinet in the mezzanine office, exactly 30 steps from the south door, and the part of her mind accustomed to calculating had already measured that distance before the rest of her could object. She went inside. Ellis wasn't at the south door. No one was there. She climbed the metal stairs, unlocked the cabinet, pulled out the file, held it against her chest, and when she turned back, the smoke was much thicker than it had been when she went up. She headed toward the east emergency exit, the door that by regulation was supposed to remain clear at all times. It wouldn't open. Through the narrow gap, she saw the blue painted steel wall of a shipping container pressed directly against the outside, blocking the doorway from one edge to the other. Maren stood there for exactly 2 breaths. No one accidentally moved a container in front of an emergency exit. Then came the sound of the south roll-up door being forced upward by hand, metal shrieking against metal. And then someone shouted her name. It was the first time he had ever called her by it. Maren. She heard shoes running across the concrete. Then something heavy came down over her head and shoulders. The black wool coat, dark and thick and still slightly damp, and a hand gripped the edge of it tightly around her face. "Stay low. Hold on to me," he said close to her ear. 30 steps. I'll count them for you." She moved. She made it about halfway before she realized she was still clutching the file against her chest, keeping herself from bending low enough. "Drop the file. It's the only original. Maren." He stopped. There, in the middle of the smoke, he stopped for half a second so he could say the whole thing. "I spent 15 years looking for your father. I'm not going looking for his daughter in a pile of ashes." She let go. The papers fell to the floor. He got her to the south door, out into the cold air off the water. And outside there were already sirens sounding in the distance, red and blue lights beginning to sweep across the sides of the containers in long bands. They sat her down on the concrete steps, wrapped her in a blanket, and put an oxygen mask over her face. At the hospital, the doctor on the night shift was a woman whose voice was so calm that people trusted it immediately. She measured. She listened. She placed the probe against Maren, and that sound filled the room again. Fast, steady, stubborn, exactly as it had that morning in the dark examination room. The doctor removed the earpieces, nodded, and said the words everyone in the room had been waiting to hear. "You and the baby are fine." Emmett Castellane, standing at the foot of the bed in a smoke-stained shirt with no coat on, lifted one hand and gripped the bed rail. It was the only time in this entire story that anyone ever saw him need something to hold on to. The next morning, after daylight had come and Maren was finally able to sit up, she told him the rest. "That file burned," Emmett said. "I know. It was the original. I photographed the entire thing last night," Maren said. "Every page. I sent it to 3 places. Attorney Bracken, an archival mailbox, and an address only I know." He looked at her for a long time. "Then why were you still holding it?" "Because I wasn't thinking then," she said. "I've been doing this work for 10 years. No one trained me how to let go of documents." She pulled the blanket higher. "But when you called my name, I let go." She looked directly at him. "You should know I didn't let go because I knew I had copies." That afternoon, Ellis Merrick came to the hospital, his face completely drained of color. He had spent the previous night at his aunt's house. His aunt confirmed it. 3 people in the house confirmed it. He hadn't sent anyone a single message. 2 days later, after the fire investigation team had finished putting up the perimeter fence and begun numbering the sample grids, a silver-gray car moved slowly into the access lane, leading to warehouse number 9, and stopped outside the marked line. There was no escort vehicle behind it. No one opened the door for him. The man stepped out by himself, closed the door himself, and stood there adjusting the collar of his coat before walking in. He was in his 60s, with neatly combed silver hair, a mouse-gray cashmere coat, and shoes so clean they looked out of place against the ash-stained concrete. Cassius stepped half a pace forward, then stopped when Emmett raised 2 fingers. Sterling Renshaw walked to the edge of the ruins and stood there for a long time, with both hands clasped behind his back, in the posture of a man paying his respects. "I heard about it yesterday morning," he said. "I'm very sorry." "I mean that." Emmett didn't answer. Warehouse fires around the harbor happen every year. Renshaw continued, his voice mild, almost gentle. People like to blame bad luck, but really it's always the same three things. Electrical wiring left over from another generation that no one ever replaces. Wooden pallets stacked too high, dry as tinder, and no one on duty at night. He slowly shook his head. When those three things come together, it only takes a little. He stepped closer, bent down, picked up a half-burned piece of wood, examined it, then dropped it, and rubbed his fingertips together. Ash clung to the sleeve of his cashmere coat. He brushed it away with one neat motion. "You know, I contribute to the city's fire prevention fund," he said. "Have for years. People know me there. If you need to reinstall the fire alarm system for this area, I can recommend a few reputable contractors. Reasonable prices, too. All you have to do is ask." "What are you doing here?" Emmett asked. Renshaw turned to look at him, and there was nothing on his face except the concern of a kindly neighbor. "To see," he said. "People should come and see things like this for themselves. Sitting in a room reading reports doesn't show you anything." Then he walked toward the car. He opened the door, rested one hand on the roof, and turned back to deliver his final sentence in exactly the same voice. "Oh, and give my regards to your accountant. Tell her to take care of herself. In her condition, smoke isn't good for her at all." He got into the car. He backed out, turned the wheel, and drove away. There wasn't a single word in the entire conversation that could be taken into court. That afternoon, Naomi Bracken arrived. She was in her 40s, her hair tied low, carrying an old briefcase and 2 spiral-bound volumes of law that she set down on the table with a dry thump. She had spent 11 years as a federal prosecutor and now worked privately, and she was the only person Emmett had been able to find with no connection whatsoever to Renshaw Meridian. "I've read everything Miss Aldridge sent me," she said, "and I've also read the original deepwater berthing permit for this facility." She opened one of the law books to a page already marked. "Have either of you ever read the continuity provision carefully?" Emmett looked at Marin. Marin shook her head. "This permit is grandfathered," Naomi said. "That means it was preserved under the old licensing system, and the federal government hasn't issued new permits of this kind in a very long time. They don't issue new ones, which means if you lose it, it's gone. No one can apply for another." She placed a finger on one line, "and it has exactly one condition. The facility must maintain continuous operating activity. If operations stop beyond the period stated here, the permit automatically expires. No one has to revoke it. No one has to issue a decision. It dies on its own." The room fell silent. Marin understood first. She placed both hands flat on the table. "They didn't burn the records," she said. "No," Naomi Bracken said. "You had already photographed the records and sent them out. And even if you hadn't, the permit itself is still in federal archives. You could burn this entire warehouse and it wouldn't erase a single line. They were never targeting the paperwork." She closed the law book. "They burned the condition." Emmett stood and walked to the window, looking down at the fenced-off ruins below. "If the warehouse stops operating, the permit dies," he said. "If the permit dies, this property becomes nothing more than a slab of concrete on the waterfront. Exactly like every other parcel," Naomi said. "And then he buys it at the price of every other parcel." Marin looked up at the clock on the wall without any intention of checking the time. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Naomi Bracken said. "The clock started running the day of the fire." "There's one way," Naomi Bracken said. "But I'm going to tell you the price first, and then you get to answer." Emmett was still standing by the window. "The container blocking the emergency exit has an identification number. That number can be traced back to the company that leased it. That's physical evidence, and it turns this from a warehouse fire into an intentional criminal act," she said. "But if you want access to it, you have to invite federal investigators into your harbor, not the city fire department." "Federal." Cassius, standing in the doorway, shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other. "You understand what happens once you do that, don't you?" Naomi said. "Once they're inside, they won't just look at the burned warehouse. They'll look at everything. 18 years of records from all 4 companies. Dock leases, money flows, personnel lists, every truck that ever passed through the gates. Wherever they find a door they can open, they'll keep going." She closed her briefcase. "You'll lose the docks, Mr. Castellane. There's a very good chance you'll lose more than that." Marin sat silently at the end of the table. She didn't say a word. She had learned that there were decisions a man had to arrive at on his own, and anyone who spoke during that journey only made him take longer to get there. Emmett didn't turn around immediately. He stood looking down below, at the fenced-off area, at the ruins still sending one thin strand of smoke into the gray afternoon. He stared at it for a long time. He thought about the night he'd run through that roll-up door, and about the stretch of time between the moment he'd called her name and the moment he'd heard her answer. Then he turned around. "Do you know what almost happened inside that warehouse?" he said. "I know," Naomi said. "Open the door." Cassius's head snapped up. "Boss, you heard me," Emmett said. No one said anything else. Naomi Bracken took out a pen, wrote 3 lines in her notebook, then capped it and looked at him. "I'll tell you something about me now, too, so you don't have to wonder about it later," she said. "Years ago, I prosecuted your father. I lost. I lost because my key witness withdrew his testimony at the last minute, after his family received something called relocation assistance from a fund financed by Renshaw Meridian." She slipped the pen into her coat pocket. "I don't work for you, Mr. Castellane. I work against him. You just happen to be the shortest road I've found in 20 years. Emmett looked at her. "Then we understand each other. We understand each other," Naomi Bracken said, then picked up her briefcase and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped and turned toward Marin. "Miss Aldridge." "Yes, the way you marked the cross-references in the documents you sent me," she said. "I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone who wasn't a prosecutor do it that way." "Who taught you?" Marin rested one hand on the stack of papers in front of her. "My father," she said. "He was an auto mechanic." The question was still hanging there, and no one dared say it aloud until Cassius finally did. Gus Merrick had told them everything from the night the hospital debt paper was placed on the table in front of him. He had been home with his wife ever since, no longer holding a key, no longer authorized to enter the gates. And yet the escort schedule for Adele Quist had still gotten out, and yet that message had still arrived. "The leak hasn't stopped," Cassius said, "which means there's a second person. They found it on Thursday afternoon, and the one who found it wasn't Cassius, but a young technician Naomi Bracken had called in." He picked up Ellis Merrick's phone, opened 3 layers of folders, then turned the screen toward everyone. "This was installed from the outside," he said. "It wasn't downloaded by accident. Someone had to physically connect the phone to another device to do this." Ellis stood there, his face drained white. "I did take the phone in for repair," he said. "The screen broke. I had it replaced at a shop near the bus terminal. Small place. They said it would be cheaper than going through the manufacturer." "Who recommended that shop to you?" Naomi asked. He looked around, then suddenly sank down onto the metal steps and buried his head in his hands. "Uncle Gus." Gus Merrick, standing at the far end of the yard, sat down too. He lowered himself all the way onto the concrete, without waiting for anyone to bring him a chair, both hands resting on his knees and shaking violently. "He told me he knew the place," he said. "Send your nephew there. I'll tell them to give him a better price." I thought he was being kind. He looked up, and his voice broke. "For 2 years, he didn't trust me for a single day. Not one day. He kept that hospital paper hanging over my head, sat there watching me do what he wanted, and the whole time he was already setting the boy up as a backup for me, in case I broke. I drove that briefcase 200 miles, Ellis said into his palms. "I thought I did well. I thought I did exactly what Miss Marin told me." He lifted his head and looked at Marin, his eyes red. "That message that night came from my number. You went inside because of a message from my number." No one said anything. Cassius looked at Emmett, and this time he wasn't waiting for an order. He was only waiting to see. Emmett walked over to the metal steps. He didn't stand above the young man and look down at him. He sat beside him on the same step and stayed there quietly for a moment. "Look at me," he said. Ellis raised his head. "You didn't betray anyone," Emmett said. "You were used. Those are 2 different things, and I need you to understand exactly how they're different," he continued, his voice still quiet. "A traitor knows what he's doing and does it anyway. You took your phone in to have the screen replaced because your uncle told you the place was cheaper. If I made you pay for that, then I'd be the one who deserved judgment." Ellis wiped his face with his sleeve. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." "Go wash your face," Emmett said. "Then get the car. Tomorrow morning I need someone to drive Attorney Bracken upstate, and I still want that someone to be you." Sabine Trawick came on Saturday morning, while the entire building was still quiet, and this time she brought a cardboard box instead of her handbag. She set it on the dining table, removed the lid, and inside were thick bound volumes, their spines labeled by hand and arranged by year. "What is this?" Marin asked. "Union contribution ledgers," Sabine said. "All 4 docs, going back to when I first started." She pulled out the top volume and opened it to a page she had already marked. "More than 2,000 dock workers in this harbor contribute to a common pension fund. The money is transferred to an outside management firm. That firm hasn't changed in years." She pushed the ledger toward Marin. "Open it." Marin did. She read for nearly 10 minutes, and during those 10 minutes she didn't say a word, and neither did Sabine Trawick. Then she looked up, and the color had changed in her face. This pension fund is being used as collateral. Keep going. It's listed as pledged security in a syndicated lending structure, Marin said. She turned back 3 pages, cross-checked the entries, then kept going. And that lending structure is financing the entire chain of waterfront acquisitions. All 3 parcels that changed hands are inside it. She placed one hand on the page, which means if that acquisition chain collapses, the money that goes down with it isn't Sterling Renshaw's. It's the retirement money of 2,000 people who walk through these dock gates every morning. Sabine nodded once. How long have you known? I've suspected it for a long time, Sabine said. I became certain almost 2 years ago. Then why are you only bringing it now? The silver-haired woman sat down, rested both hands on her knees, and looked toward the glass wall. I've kept the books for this harbor for 30 years, she said. 30 years sitting in rooms full of men who thought women only knew how to add and subtract. If I'd brought this out 2 years ago, they would have thanked me, taken it from my hands, put it in a drawer, and told me not to worry. She turned back toward Marin. I waited until there was someone in this room who knew how to read it. Marin didn't sleep that night. She sat at the dining table beneath the desk lamp, and in front of her were 3 things: the union ledgers, the personnel list for the trust funds that Naomi Bracken had sent over late that afternoon, and her father's leather-bound notebook. She picked up the notebook. She opened to the first page as she always did, and read the words again. Then, she did something she hadn't done in the 12 years since he died. She turned past the second page, where there was only the single line she herself had recently written. Then she kept going. Page 3, page 4, page 10, the entire notebook, from beginning to end, was crowded with writing. Slanted ballpoint script, stiff at first, then shakier toward the later pages. Dates along the left margin, customer names, license plate numbers, repairs performed, amounts paid. Besides some entries were short notes: customer coming tonight, paid cash, no receipt requested. 12 years of records kept by a mechanic in Southie. A man who had written down every car that ever passed through his hands, recorded everything. All of it, because he was the kind of man who believed that if you wrote something clearly enough, no one could deny it later. Marin read backward from the final page, and she stopped at a page about a quarter of the way from the end. 3 lines, 3 visits, on 3 different dates, the same license plate each time. Beside that plate number, her father had written the owner's name exactly the way he always did, in capital letters, without abbreviations: Sterling Renshaw. And the dates in the left margin were years earlier than the date that man had repeatedly claimed in every official filing as the beginning of any involvement he had ever had with the harbor. Marin set the notebook down on the table. She sat motionless for a long time. The next morning, she called Emmett and Naomi Bracken over, and she placed the 3 items on the table in order. First, she said, the pension fund, 2,000 people. She pushed the second file forward. Second, my father's notebook. Renshaw was operating around this harbor long before the date he claims. Every time he said otherwise under oath or in a regulatory filing, that's another false statement. Then she placed the 3rd sheet down, the personnel list. And third, she said, Gideon Pryor never left this city. Emmett picked up the page. He didn't disappear, Marin said. He changed sides. He's now the compliance director for a trust fund owned by Renshaw Meridian. He took the job 3 months after leaving your 4 companies. Naomi Bracken bent down to read it, and she understood before Emmett did. That fund is an interested party in the fire investigation, she said, which means the compliance report submitted to the investigators will be signed by him. He's sitting on the side of the table that writes the conclusion of the investigation, Marin said. Then she continued, her voice very calm, and that's his fatal mistake. The person who signs a report becomes responsible for that report. He thinks he just climbed into the safest position available. What he actually did was put his own name in exactly the place no one will ever be able to remove it from later. The room remained silent for a long time. Wallace Aldridge had lost the battle of his life. He had lost his shop, lost everything, and died without recovering a single dollar. But for 12 years, with a ballpoint pen and a $3 notebook, that mechanic had quietly built something that a team of million-dollar lawyers would one day be unable to tear apart. Naomi Bracken wanted to take everything to court. Marin said no. He has 4 law firms, she said. He'll drag this out for 10 years. And during those 10 years, he'll still be having dinner with the mayor. The courtroom is his ground, not ours. Then where is our ground? Marin placed her hand on the union ledger. Here. The preparation took 4 days. Sabine Trowick pulled the lists. Rourke Delahaye called the foreman of every shift across all 4 docks, and he called each one himself, asking no one else to do it for him, because he said there were some things people only believed when they heard the voice of someone they knew. Gus Merrick, even though he no longer had a key to the gates. Spent 2 full nights at his kitchen table, matching names against insurance card numbers. Ellis Merrick drove boxes of printed sheets from dock to dock, and Marin, sitting at the dining table with a belly that had begun forcing her to prop an extra pillow behind her back, prepared exactly 1 page for each person. It wasn't a flyer. There were no slogans on it. Only that person's name, that person's retirement account number, the amount that person had contributed over all those years, and beneath it a single line stating exactly which loan that money was currently being used to secure and whose loan it was. "You're not adding anything else?" Emmett asked. "There's no need," Marin said. "The numbers can speak for themselves." Saturday morning was clear. The Renshaw Meridian building stood in the financial district. 18 stories of blue glass facing a stone-paved plaza lined with several maple trees. On weekends, the area was quiet, with only a few joggers and a coffee cart. The first man arrived before the sky had fully brightened. He was a crane hook operator from the South Dock, who had been doing the job for 31 years, wearing a faded orange reflective jacket, and he stood alone beneath a street lamp with a sheet of paper in his hand. Then 4 more people came. Then a small bus stopped at the corner and 20 people stepped off. Then more. They came in their own cars, by train, in union vehicles, on foot from parking several blocks away. Men and women, some young, some nearing retirement, most of them wearing reflective jackets, because those were the jackets they already owned. By the time the sun rose above the rooftops, the plaza was full, more than 2,000 people, and nothing happened. No one shouted a single word. No one held a megaphone. There were no banners, no drums, no one climbing the steps. They simply stood there, each person holding 1 sheet of paper across their chest, faces turned toward the glass doors, and they remained silent. That silence spread across the entire plaza, and it carried more weight than any chant could have. A police car arrived, parked at the edge, and 2 officers got out and looked around. Then they stood there and did nothing too, because there was nothing to do. The television crews arrived before the second police car. A reporter stepped into the crowd, held a microphone toward the crane hook operator who had worked there for 31 years, and asked what they were demanding. He wasn't demanding anything. He simply raised his sheet of paper toward the camera and said, "Read it. This is my money. I just want to know where it is." By mid-morning, images of the plaza were already airing on 3 stations. Before lunchtime, Renshaw Meridian's stock price began to fall, and it wasn't falling because of an indictment. It was falling because 2,000 people were standing still. Marin stood across the street beneath the shade of a maple tree, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding the collar of her coat closed. Emmett stood beside her and said nothing. She looked at that 18-story wall of blue glass, looked at the white sheets held across thousands of chests filling the plaza, and thought of a mechanic in Southie who had sat in his shop every evening, opened a $3 notebook, and written down the license plate number of a car, without having any idea where that car would one day lead. The meeting was confirmed on Tuesday morning, and this time it was Sterling Renshaw who had asked for it. His office was on the 18th floor, a corner room with 2 walls of glass overlooking the harbor and the plaza that had been completely empty for the past 3 days. Photographs of him shaking hands with governors hung on the walls, and in one corner stood a white plastic model of a deepwater port inside a glass case. His secretary opened the door. Emmett walked in first. Marin followed behind, moving slowly because she was 7 months pregnant, and she made no effort to hurry. Renshaw stood and gestured toward 2 chairs. No one sat down. "I'm glad you both came," he said. "This has gone much farther than it needed to. I believe there's still a way to resolve this, without anyone losing anything more." Emmett placed a thin folder on the desk. "Look at this first." Renshaw didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it, then pulled it toward himself, and opened it. He read the first page. Then he read the first page again. "Your corporation's entire syndicated loan has been bought out," Emmett said, "through 3 intermediary entities. The transaction was completed last week. All 3 banks sold. Very quickly, I should add. Especially after what happened Saturday morning." He tapped 2 fingers against the edge of the folder, "which means that as of today, the party with the right to demand payment from you is no longer those banks. It's me." Renshaw set the folder down. His face didn't change, but he remained silent longer than necessary. Then Marin stepped half a pace forward and placed 3 sheets of paper on the desk. They were only photographs. Letter-sized paper, printed in black and white, slightly crooked because the originals had been photographed by hand. On them were 3 lines written in ballpoint pen, the handwriting slanted and stiff, dates in the left margin, a license plate number, and a name written in capital letters. "What is this?" Renshaw asked. "The notebook of an auto mechanic in Southie." Marin said. He recorded every car that passed through his hands for 12 years. These 3 entries are your car. The dates here are 8 years earlier than the date you stated in the filings you submitted to the Planning Board, and in the filings you submitted to the Port Authority Commission, and in the asset declaration you signed under oath 3 years ago. She pushed the 3 pages toward the center of the desk. You didn't make one false statement. You made a false statement every time you signed your name. Sterling Renshaw looked up at her, and for the first time in this entire story, he looked directly into her face. Truly looked, instead of merely glancing past her, the way he had at the ruins. He looked at the loose coat, the 7-month belly, the flat shoes. "Who are you?" he said. "Who are you to stand here and—" "I'm the person you paid to erase from this profession," Marin said. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke in exactly the same tone she used when reading a line from a balance sheet. "You did it very well, Mr. Renshaw. I mean that. 30 applications without a single response. No one rejected me. No one explained anything to me. You cost me my job, my home, the person I once trusted. You took everything I had. And you did it so cleanly that for 4 months I thought there was something wrong with me." He didn't answer. "The problem is this," she said. "You can only buy someone who still has something left to lose. Someone who still has a position, a reputation, a name in the profession. You took all of that from me at the very beginning. So by the time I sat down in front of Mr. Castellane's 4 sets of books, there was nothing left in this world that you could offer me in exchange for my silence." She rested one hand on the edge of the desk. "That was the only accounting error of your entire career. You erased me too, completely. No one said anything else." Emmett picked up his folder, leaving the 3 photographed pages on the desk, and the 2 of them walked out. Warehouse number 9 resumed operations 3 days before the deadline. They cleared the ash by hand, raised a temporary roof on a steel frame, and more than 200 people showed up for the first shift after the fire, most of them not scheduled to work, and not one of them asked about wages. They were the same 2,000 people who had stood silently in the plaza on Saturday. They kept that permit alive by doing exactly what its condition required. They came to work. The federal investigation lasted throughout the winter, and it went exactly where Naomi Bracken had warned it would. They didn't just look at the container that had blocked the emergency exit. They looked at everything. 18 years of records from all 4 companies were opened, 1 page at a time. Every dock lease, every flow of money, every name on the payroll. Emmett Castelaine didn't hire anyone to argue on his behalf. He sat in the study with the investigators session after session, voluntarily, with a lawyer beside him who barely needed to speak. The result wasn't a declaration of innocence. He took a deal. He surrendered every record. He divested himself completely from the dock system, all 4 docks, without retaining a single share. He accepted judicial supervision for years and was barred from taking part in the management of any port operation for the entire duration of that period. He kept warehouse number 9, kept his freedom, and lost the thing 3 generations of his family had built. The morning he walked out of the federal building after the final hearing, the air was cold and dry, and Cassius was waiting at the curb with the car door already open. There were no longer 3 cars behind him, only one. "Boss," Cassius said. Emmett stopped. "Don't call me that anymore, Cass. Then what do I call you?" He looked up toward the 3rd-floor windows of the hospital across the street, where a woman was waiting for the day her child would be born. "Emmett," he said, "just use my name." The remaining names fell one by one, like knots being loosened from a net. Gideon Pryor was arrested at the trust office where he served as compliance director, because he had signed a report concerning a matter in which he himself had a financial interest, and no one could remove that signature for him. Prescott Lyle volunteered to testify in exchange for a lighter sentencing recommendation. Alden Ferris drove himself to Naomi Bracken's office and turned over the entire service file along with the name of the person who had paid him, and he said he'd been thinking about that question for months. Hollis Marsh lost his notary license, and then lost his store too, because no one in the neighborhood wanted to shop at a place like that anymore. The first snow of the season fell over Boston Harbor on a night near the end of the month, and the baby was born the following morning. A boy. The nurse asked for a name to put on the identification bracelet, and Marin, her hair still damp with sweat, answered without hesitation. Wallace Aldridge Castelaine. Emmett stood beside the bed, and for a long moment he couldn't say anything. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out the old wrench, the one that had remained inside a locked drawer for 15 years. Its handle worn smooth, exactly where a person's thumb naturally rested. He placed it in that tiny palm for exactly 1 second. Then he took it back and put it away. Dorian Vale testified in court that spring, telling exactly what he knew about the payment that had sent him out of the city. When the court recessed, He found Marin in the hallway, and he started to say something about the baby, about time, about how everyone made mistakes. She didn't let him finish. "I don't forgive you," she said. "I'm just not carrying you with me anymore. You're too heavy." Then she walked away. Many months later, when the baby was strong enough to sit in a front-facing carrier, Marin walked past the corner of Wharf Line on a windy afternoon. The old store had changed owners, with a new sign and clean glass in the windows. Across the street, Hollis Marsh was standing there with a paper bag in his hand, staring inside, and when he saw her, he immediately turned his face away, unable to keep looking, unable to come closer. Marin stopped. Then she crossed the street and walked toward him. He looked up, his eyes red, and he couldn't form a single sentence. She didn't wait for him to try. "It's cold, Mr. Marsh," she said. "You should go home." Then she kept walking. That summer, they held a small gathering one afternoon at Warehouse Number 9. It wasn't a celebration. Not really. Just everyone being there together. Gus Merrick came with his wife, Rosalie, who was much stronger now and could walk with a cane. Ellis Merrick handled the grill. Rourke Delahaye stood near the water, complaining about the wind. Sabine Trowick brought a stack of old ledgers to turn over to the archives, and she sat for a long time talking with Walter Fenwick about ships that no longer existed. Margot brought cake, and 7-year-old June ran over to Marin with a paper boat in her hand, its creases pressed so carefully that the edges had gone shiny. She held it out to the baby sitting on his mother's lap. "I still talk to him every day," she announced proudly, "even when he was still inside your belly. So now he already knows me, and we don't have to start all over again." Then she placed the paper boat on the water, and it floated. Emmett stood beside Marin, with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out across those 300 meters of deep water that he no longer had the authority to control. No crane stopped moving when he walked past. No one removed a cap. The afternoon shift workers nodded to him the way people nodded to someone they knew from the neighborhood, and he nodded back. Marin looked sideways at him. "Do you regret it?" "Yes," he said. "The first few days, I regretted it a lot." He looked down at the baby reaching for the paper boat. Not anymore. Wallace Aldridge's kindness had remained still for 15 years, in the shape of an old wrench, inside a locked drawer no one had dared ask about. Then one November morning, it woke up, stepped out into the rain, and went looking for his daughter. There are acts of kindness we do for other people whose results we may never live long enough to see. Wallace Aldridge pulled a strange young man into his repair shop on a rainy night, and he died without ever knowing that the same act, 15 years later, would return to save his daughter and the grandson he would never meet. Kindness doesn't disappear. It only lies still, waiting for the right moment, and then it comes back. And there is one more thing this story wants to leave with you. A person's worth isn't measured by how much they have. It's measured by what they choose to do when they have nothing left in their hands. Marin Aldridge entered this story with $3.40 and a torn knee. And the one thing she refused to let go of was the principle her father had taught her. It was that principle, not luck, that carried her all the way through. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day we can listen together to more meaningful stories like this one. And how do you feel about Marin? About Emmett? About that quiet mechanic who was her father? Please leave a comment below and tell us what you truly feel from the deepest part of your heart, because we genuinely want to hear from you. May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.